So what we're looking at is the Burney relief here. And in 2002, to mark the 250th anniversary, the British Museum actually made a very large purchase of a very small terracotta plaque featuring a woman-animal hybrid, perhaps a goddess and perhaps a demon. On her head is a coiled crown. In each hand, she holds a ring and rod, a classic accompaniment of divinity in Mesopotamian art. She stands on top of two male lions and is flanked by two owls. Her own wings are tucked politely behind her back, and her bird-like legs are perched on the lions' backs. She faces the viewer head on, a serene smile on her beautiful face. The British Museum made this purchase from a Mr. Sakamoto for £1.5 million and changed the name of the figure from the Burney relief. It was originally named after Sidney Burney, who had purchased it in 1935, to the Queen of the Night. She has been variously identified as Ishtar, Ereshkigal, and others, but the name that was perhaps most commonly associated with her in the 20th century was Lilith. Lilith was the mythical first wife of Adam. I think that perhaps this is known to many of the viewers here. So I'm going to give a very, very short introduction as to who she's more kind of widely known as before I get into the kind of meat of the work. So we get her referenced in numerous rabbinical and sacred Jewish texts. Perhaps the most interest to me was the alphabet of Ben Sira, which was likely written around 700 to 1000 AD in dialects of Aramaic and Hebrew. But we saw European editions in 1514, 1519, and 1544. But she's much more than this, right? She's much more than the mythical first wife of Adam. So sometimes Lilith is plural. She's not even singular. She's Lilith and represents kind of several demons or spirits who inhabit deserts or wild places. Some scholars interpret her within the Gilgamesh tradition, and some claim that the Burney relief is really her. In Hebrew religious texts, like the Masoretic texts in the 9th century, and in the Dead Sea Scrolls, she makes an appearance as a savage night spirit who lives with the beasts of the forests or deserts. However, later in the Greek Septuagint tradition and in the Latin Vulgate, she is almost completely erased. And her sometime emergence in the book of Isaiah now becomes mere beast or owl, though sometimes also Lamia. And this term Lamia is going to really influence sort of depictions of Lilith up until the 17th century when she makes a resurgence by name. So this Lamia here is going to take center stage in representations of the demonic feminine. For many centuries, Lilith is obscured in European occult traditions, only to make a comeback at the end of the 15th century, perhaps with the expulsion of the Jews from Spain, which led to their migration to other major intellectual centers in Europe, and also the transmission of their mythologies and ideas and histories. Though we will get mentions of Lilith in English in the 16th century, it isn't until 1617 in the 17th century in John Selden's work that we get any attempt of a systematic account of Lilith in Latin, and that we get our first Latin text on Lilith available to English readers. So there are other Latin works available, but they're not available to English readers. And it wasn't until 1637 in an English translation of Leona Modana's History of the Hebrew Rituals that we get in English our first solid mention of Lilith as Adam's first but disobedient wife. See if I can go to my next slide here. Here we go. So I'm not sure when I first heard the name Lilith, but I do remember two specific encounters during my adolescence. First, of course, the all-female music festival, Lilith Fair, right? I don't know if any of us remember that from the 90s. But also, I remember in an art history class in high school, Rossetti's Lady Lilith. So both of these instances contained an element of rebellion that my teenage self craved, certainly. And while I was fascinated by her and her story, it wasn't until graduate school that I began an examination of her history, meaning, and associations. In 2006, I had recently taken on study for a doctoral degree at University of Edinburgh, and I was considering the intersections between gender, witchcraft, and occultism. At the time, there was very little academic work concerned with gender in the occult. And on the surface, outside of the large field of historical study on early modern witchcraft, there didn't really appear to be much in the way of interest either. There didn't seem to be much source material outside of writing on witchcraft, either in the form of Renaissance polemics against magic, dismissals of magical realities in favor of scientific explorations and explanations, or witchcraft trial records. However, within this, I was able to find a home temporarily in aspects that fascinated me about early modern witchcraft. So anxieties surrounding women's sexuality, feminine power, and fears of darkness and chaos. So there were two textual encounters which led me away from a more general examination of witchcraft and the allure and the aversion of chaos, right? Which was originally what drew me to this. The first was in 2007, when I was reading the diaries of John Dee in the National Library of Scotland. In a May 1587 entry, he relates his scryer Edward Kelly's experience with a feminine spirit, Madimi. There was something so deeply intriguing about the way in which the diary entry becomes filled with anxiety about Madimi's, the spirit, her sexuality, her likely relation to evil, and eventually what came later in the form of an episode of marital cross-matching, during which John Dee and Edward Kelly were commanded by the spirit to swap wives as part of their philosophical, spiritual, and occult ascension. The way Madimi, the spirit, entered into this world was so profoundly different from other spirits, all of whom were either explicitly masculine or their genders not mentioned. Madimi's appearances were often sexually charged, and at one point she pulls aside her clothing to reveal what assume is her genitalia. John Dee is circumspect about not disclosing too much detail about this particular afternoon. And what essentially were just a few lines in a diary ended up attaching itself to my psyche in such a way that I still think about it today. The second encounter was in 2009 when I was spending the autumn in London in the rare books room of the British Library. I traveled down to England on a grant from the Center for Medieval and Renaissance Studies to look at De Dies Syris, or On the Syrian Gods. This is by John Selden. It was originally published in 1617. It was here that I would make my major sort of like academic discovery, which would become the center of my doctoral research. This is his chapter on Astarte, in which he argues that all permutations of the sacred feminine moon are actually representations of Lilith. They are encountered through what Umberto Eco calls hermetic drift, or semiotic association, a central principle in much early modern magical practice, which relies on occult sympathies. The idea that seemingly disconnected or unrelated objects, ideas, celestial spheres, etc., have hidden attachments that can be discovered and potentially manipulated. In this moment, I began to suspect that Lilith played a much more important role than is generally assumed, and I began to dig deeper, and she appeared readily, sometimes implicitly, but often very explicitly. So this is a page from De Dies Syris, just so you can get a sense about what it looks like. I've highlighted areas that are maybe of interest to us and kind of translated them here. And I'll read a longer translation in a moment. So 17th century writers like Selden and others are going to warn that she is Lamia, who lures men to their deaths with her beautiful breasts, which emerge from her scaly lion body. Or that she is the dark side of Cynthia, Lucina, or Diana, representing the wicked other to the virgin moon. The sensual dark goddess of the night, essentially. Some likened her to Hecate, others called her the goddess of witchcraft. And I did not abandon my interest in the history of early modern witchcraft, but instead began to contextualize it within a larger constellation that was starting to web with a kind of center which pointed to Lilith. This book was written to understand this constellation of symbols and meanings within the context of the Renaissance. and through the lens of our own 21st century relationships and constructed meanings. After spending mornings in the rare books room at the British Library, translating Selden, I would wander over to the British Museum and gaze up at the face of the Queen of the Night. So I did a translation of part of this chapter. And so I'm going to just kind of read. It's just, I know the language is kind of dense, but just to get a kind of sense of what Selden is saying and how these early modern writers are putting together these connections. So, okay, let me move this so I can see. Covella, however, is interpreted as Coelestis, heaven, or Uranus. The ancients called Coelum as Covum, as written by Sextus Pomponius. And Uranus, who was received from the Carthaginians, was venerated by King Massinissa of the Numidians, as he followed her with so much honor that he made a temple for Juno in the island of Melita, to which Cicero refers in his Act 4 against Verus. However, this Coelestis, or Venus, or Luna, the moon, as the Assyrians call Melita, the Arabs call Aliat, and the Persians call Mitra, as is written by Herodotus and Thalia. Melita, as Scaliger notes, is a mere Chaldea word, meaning mother, which is one of the more noted epitaphs of Venus. Hesychius notes or says of these words that Aliat comes from the most learned Arabs, Halilath, and all who would ask would signify Luna and the rising or horned moon, and also Noctiluna or night shiner. Hence, Lucina of the Latins is to be translated, that is, Aletheia of the Greeks, who is none other than Luna or Diana, and is called Lilith among the Jews, who flows from the same Halilath of the Arabs, the source of Layla, namely, that is the night, and therefore Lilith. Lilith, however, is rendered as Noctiluna or night demon. Much more nonsense is the Greek speaking, who says that it is Aletheum, ridiculously speaking of this kind of their native languages, but of Lilith we see in Isaiah. And of the Jews today, believe Lilith to be an enemy of women in childbirth and their children. And according to ancient rites, they surreptitiously write charms on waxen tablets with these words, Adam, Shava, Chutz Lilith, or Lilith, be gone from here. Literally, the translation is Adam, Eve, out Lilith. They drove away the goddess of the Gentiles, being a demon. The ancient Greeks, tossed in the storms of the sea, it was the custom for them to exclaim the same way. It was necessary for the pretending pious Jew to hold these gods as demons. This is seen from many things, from Ben Sira, I talked a little bit about the alphabet of Ben Sira earlier, and Elias in Thisbe, and in Ben Maimon's more, his work. In addition to the praised rabbis from the place of Isaiah and the Archangelum in the teaching of Pico in the Kabbalah, hence she is named Lacuna or Lucina. It is not difficult to translate this to one or other of the words Lilith or Alelith, which is the name that the Arabs call her. And she is Lilith to the Asians, so she was to the goddess Aletheia to the Europeans, and was enemy to women in labor who dreaded her. Therefore, she was placated with supplications, as she is called in the hymns falsely attributed to Orpheus. If she is present, favorably inclined and conciliated, she served the parent and the small newly born child. But if the opposite remained, she afflicted both with grave misfortune. And so in the works of Theocritus, the Idols, she is a girl. She is called by Homer Mogostikos, and Michael Salas in his De Operat Daemonum writes, and I have heard from many that she prepares a female demon for all infants in a feminine form. If I do not misunderstand the ancients, Galeus says that she is Impusa, and I am permitted to consult these things before others. Hesychius and Aristophanes and the scholastics and the frogs. Of Lucina, it is true, and Lilith and Aletheia is understood to be the same as that which we call the fays or the fairies. They are the same kind. Okay, last slide of reading, I promise. And these words are called Aletheia by Didymus Homer and the Scholastics, and by Sophocles and Electra. Of Aletheia, much is written in the works of Plutarch, where he considers women. Homer does not, but he does endure pains and write of Lucina in the Iliad, where Eustathius notes of the writings of the ancients that she is Aletheia. And so from the bow, she sends pain and bitterness with a sharp spear. In order to avoid childbearing pains, it is custom to implore the aid of Juno, Lucina, or of Aletheia, just as it is seen in the comedies, but none other than the god of the Polemos in the Eumaides, or make supplications to the angry gods. It can be added with accuracy. It is clear that not only with the similarity of the names, but also by the duties which they perform, that Aletheia or Eleuthio and Lilith were not at all different deities. Or so from the fetus of the parent in the Alethian guardianship, which was dangerous and divine, which was the dangerous and divine goddess, being taught to appease unfavorable omens against which prayers are usually taken. But of this in passing, not so far or unseasonably. None does not see that all of these belong to Luna. The same Lucina, Aletheia, Diana, we learn of such distant names that only those who are childish do not know, as in Cicero in the second work of De Natura Deorum and in Catullus' epigrams. Let us return to the truth of the Arabic name. The same letters, Aleph or night, are able to denote the night shiner. It is written the same by the Arabs, and yet Urania is not called those names by the Arabs, according to Herodotus, but Alilit, who is the same itself as Mylitta to the Assyrians. The same goddess is binomial to the Arabs as the divinity of those people. Certainly, Alita could be sought in the same place from where Mylitta is the theme and signifies giving birth. So I'm sorry for that kind of awkward reading. It's kind of awkward reading in general. But one of the things that I kind of wanted to show in this is how much he's kind of engaging in what Umberto Eco called semiotic drift or hermetic drift. So the idea that things that seem similar are not actually different, that they are deeply connected through kind of these occult sympathies. And that also, right, that they're not different deities. So when we are talking about the moon, we're really talking about Lilith. We're really talking about Diana, that all of these things are actually the same. So he kind of brings them together and says that they're all different cultural manifestations of the same deity or the same being. So, you know, as a side note, kind of, when people complain that the Burney relief isn't really depicting Lilith, I can only kind of shrug and smile and remember Selden in a sense. So after I did this translation of Selden, I returned to Edinburgh, and in some ways, Scotland is kind of the ideal place to write this book, not only because of the access to important 16th and 17th century material in the National Library of Scotland, but because of a general suspension of dogmatic rationality. Though to many, Edinburgh kind of represents nothing, if not rationalism and scientific revolution, there also seems to be a willingness there to live one's life not totally confined by rationalism's manufactured epistemology. And though I was encouraged by the university to maintain professional academic distance from the material that I was researching, I discovered that there are only so many boundaries that you can erect against the intangible. I visited St. Andrew's Old Kirk, where the famous North Berwick witches were accused of attacking King James of Scotland using magic. And I lived across the site from the original Old Tolbooth, where they were brought for their torture in Edinburgh. After spending days and weeks kind of bent over grimoires, occult manuscripts, and bestiaries in libraries, my dreams would be filled with visions of spirits, demons, and yes, even Lilith. This book is the product of those countless reading room hours. nighttime musings, wanderings, restless sleep, and the genuine attempt to try to hold myself apart from the information and experiences that entered my mind through the medium of the faded black text on the yellow pages. There's something vital in the chaos of Lilith's promise, which appealed to my anarchistic leanings. How she toppled hierarchies, threatened kings and patriarchs, abandoned her mediocre husband, and even denied the command from the angels. Much of my book explores the dark femininity of Lilith in connection with political upheaval, thinking about who is doing the hand-wringing over women's sexuality and anxieties over the solidity of patriarchy. And also thinking about why, and how villainy and heroism are often matters of perspective. These pages are a working through of how Lilith appears covertly or overtly in the imagination of male authors as a boogie, symbolizing or embodying their deepest masculine fears. Fears that they might lose their power, that the order that they worked so hard to impose on nature could slip into chaos, and also, incredibly, that they might lose their ability to have erections or even lose their penis. So these male anxieties are related, I'm arguing, and they coalesce in the terror surrounding feminine demons and Lilith in particular. There is something so compelling to me about the lawlessness of the dark feminine, and whether we experience it as terrible or terrific is perhaps merely a matter of perspective. Either way, however, there is a classic warning that even the great Thebes could not withstand the chaotic violence of the Maenads who found their dark power in the deep of the night forests. Okay, so let's move back to this here. So this book is full of Lilith, obviously, but also full of Madimi, John Dee, John Selden, and many others. I've largely structured it chronologically, beginning with the ways that occult philosophies like Hermeticism, Neoplatonism, and other esoteric systems developed in the Middle Ages, and moving into the Italian humanist movement of Marsilio Ficino and Pico della Mirandola, for instance. I try to give attention to the way that occult philosophy traveled through various transmissions in the form of human migration, as I noticed earlier, the forced expulsion of the Jews from Spain in 1492, or sometimes in the form of letters, like those that were exchanged between Rabbi Leona Modena and John Milton, my favorite poet. So it's John Milton's work that I finish with here, and in particular, his 1667 Paradise Lost. So I'm arguing that Lilith was a larger part of European literary and occult culture than is previously acknowledged, and that she was perhaps a dark influence over Milton's epic in which he retells the story of Genesis, where humankind is created, falls prey to temptation, and is expelled from the garden. Lilith is present as the shadow side of Eve, and her reflections can be found in various places within Milton's verse. When I finished the research for this project in 2011, she seemed for me to be around every bend in the Edenic path or about to emerge from every body of water. I'm exploring the demonic feminine in textual references, of course, since with my training, it was the clearest way to get a picture of how people thought and felt. Art was also an important component in this work, and I spent many hours gazing at the figures and faces of witches, magicians, and demons as depicted in paintings and book illustrations. However, the main bulk of my inquiry is dedicated to text in the form of political polemics, bestiaries, grimoires, poetry, and plays. The last of these, poetry and drama, make up the majority of my analysis, and not only because I was researching a graduate degree in literature, though of course that played an influential part. There is something I think inherently occult about poetry, and how the meaning is hidden in the blank spaces around and between the texts and the words themselves. These words ask us to look beyond the printed symbol to the ungraspable eternity outside the text's bare meaning. The power of metaphor and symbolism pervades both poetry and the occult. And though there is also the reality of metaphor hiding forbidden objects from censors, Metaphor can also reveal the unknowable to those who desire knowledge. While poetry and dramatic literature possesses a flexibility, which allows us to be guided to a place where we can look beyond the words, we must be careful not to get caught up in the metaphor itself, but rather try to look outside the space of language and logic to the infinite chaos that the metaphor can point us to. The Renaissance representations of Lilith can be examples of these metaphors, as she has always embodied a refusal of order and ordering. For these reasons and others, there is certainly plenty of adoration for her in the pages of my book. As a young woman away from home for her first time, she seemed an ideal guide for my contributions towards my thoughts on sexual freedom, feminism, violence, and autonomy. And when I first began this project 15 years ago now, these were subjects which were very much on my mind. Because of the academic constraints of my original project, I was forced to explore Lilith in a very particular way that would be acceptable to the institution granting my degree. However, within these parameters, I was able to read, explore, and bring to light texts and ideas which had been long buried. The book I wrote is essentially an academic book, full of institutional conventions and guided by the limitations of doctoral research. And for this reason, this book is only one part of my love for Lilith. It is the love for Lilith guided by my desire to conform to the standards of the university, and also a youthful love guided by the earnest belief that secrets can be uncovered and that mysteries can be solved. It's perhaps a naive idea. In this book, I was so eager to find her, to pin her down in an effort that can lead to certainly, an effort that can lead to certainty only in the way that Hermetic drift can find certainty. If language and metaphor always point to something just behind them, just out of reach, then they too are slippery, too slippery to be pinned down as they move through infinite potential meanings. Only the hubris of my youth could lead me to believe that I could wrestle down a god. Really, 10 years have passed since I completed the first phase of this work, and I still find much love and passion and inspiration in it. Beyond the privileged access to demonological literature and research libraries, this work asks what is behind the symbol. I do not, and have never, even in the university, taken a materialistic and scientific approach to my work. I never want to say that Lilith is merely a metaphor. However, I hesitate to reify her in many ways that the occult Renaissance writers attempted to do, and the ways in which some modern ones do. In the space between reification and symbol exists the site of the occult, and here lives Lilith. Joseph Campbell warns us never to mistake the mask for the god, never to confuse the symbol for the thing beyond, towards which the symbol suggests. When someone gestures at the moon, don't get stuck examining the pointing finger. In many of these early modern tales, we can see writers desperate to manipulate reality through the uncovering of secrets, but I don't think that's how this stuff works. I don't think that the pathway here is one that's going to lead to Lilith. In this book, I work through much of these references and these attempts at uncovering. And really, a lot of what I find is anxiety, fear, and the loss of masculine power. This book chronicles these references and these fears as they emerged in early modern Europe. But I'd like to take this opportunity to say that Lilith is not simply emotion. And I would not like for readers to imagine that the book that I wrote argues that she is reducible to mere psychological phenomenon responding to specific socio-political contexts. This book doesn't make any claims to which Lilith is, but only to how people imagined her during this important transition between the primacy of the church and the ascension of science and reason. These 16th and 17th century writings give us insight and potential methods for imagining Lilith, and I am still impressed by these authors' attempts to reach the unseeable dark side of her hidden face through the symbolism and association that was available to them. I hope that this work acts as its own gesture towards that hidden face, and that readers experience the reaching towards her dark chaos beyond the words which might seem to attempt to circumscribe her meanings, but which in reality, I hope, tries to bridge the space between the known and the unknowable. If you find the depictions in my book confusing, trite, or contradictory, then remember that there is no clarity to be found here. There are only descriptions of masks and the hopes that we can experience the chaotic void which they partially contain. And that's the end. Thank you. I think that that's a really good description of it. That, you know, the idea of Lamia as seduction, as dangerous. I think, of course, for the Romantics, right, which is a little bit after the period that I'm looking at, that she and her dark power are a kind of source for the creativity, which is a kind of response against the scientific rationalism. So if, you know, the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution is about rationalism, Romanticism is a kind of response to that. And you see Lamia and Lilith coming up in Keats' work, but also, you know, in Rossetti, and a lot of other Romantics are returning to her specifically, like not just like kind of random demons or spirits, but like, you know, Lamia and Lilith specifically make a huge comeback during the Romantic period. And if you think about like, okay, if we're imagining these like two kind of opposed forces, like the force of the rational and the order, and then against the sort of force of the chaotic and the darkness, we can almost think of them in terms of like Apollonian and Dionysian forces, where the Apollonian represents the kind of rational and the logical and the order and the law, and the Dionysian kind of represents chaos and darkness and emotion. And I think that's where we find Lilith, is in the Dionysian, you know, to kind of draw a parallel between those two things. Well, if we could psychologize Lilith, we can try and do that. Obviously, in the book and in Selden's book, and I'm kind of taking up Selden's argument that he makes at the beginning of the 17th century, that she doesn't necessarily have one origin. And I would say, again, that we shouldn't get too caught up in the metaphor of who she is, because the metaphor is pointing to something beyond it. So, you know, the etymological origins, people point to the Lilith, which were kind of like spirits who lived in the kind of deserts of West Asia, right, the Near East. And then at some point, right, through kind of semiotic transmigration, she becomes a single person. And then in Judaic mythology, she becomes the mythical first wife of Adam. So Adam and Eve is the story that we're normally told, but many like kind of Hebraic scholars are kind of concerned with the two accounts of creation in Genesis. So we have the account in Genesis 1 where man and woman are made from clay together, and then you have suddenly like all this stuff happens, and then suddenly randomly in Genesis 2 you get this other creation story where Eve is made from the rib of Adam. So this and other sort of things had led them to sort of place Lilith in the place of this mysterious first wife. So she is the first wife of Adam, the story goes, and this isn't like a modern story, this is like an ancient story, so this is why it's also so great, is that they were made from clay together. Adam wanted to be on top during sex, she wanted to be on top during sex, and they got into a little bit of an argument over it. And part of this argument is about power. So who is kind of on top hierarchically? So here we can see sexual position being related to a kind of position in like society, for lack of a better word. It wasn't really like society back then. So she leaves him and she goes to the Red Sea, and she's chilling in the Red Sea for a while. Adam is totally distraught. He pleads to God to send the angels to get her. So the angels go and try and convince her to come back, and she refuses. She says, why would I go back to Adam when I've been in the Red Sea, right, and enjoyed the Red Sea? And so that's when God creates Adam a second wife from his rib so that she would be directly subservient to him. So that's kind of the story that we get in terms of her in Hebraic mythology. But obviously there's like, she appears a lot before that too. So as a demon, and whether or not someone's like a demon or a god, I mean, I feel like, and I say this a lot, like this is just really a matter of perspective. In Milton's On the Morning of Christ's Nativity, I think he outlines this really well, where he talks about how all of the gods and great heroes of the Near East get kind of demoted to become mere demons in Christian mythology. So whether or not someone's a demon or a god, I think is going to just depend on what tradition you come from. And so obviously in the Christian tradition, Lilith is a demon, but in other traditions, you know, she could be a neutral spirit, representing some kind of primordial nature force, or she could be a god, right? Because, you know, Selden also is saying that she is the same as Ishtar and Astarte and others. You know, this is going to sound really pretentious, but I don't really engage in that much modern film and media. But I remember watching randomly, what's that film with Robert De Niro and Keanu Reeves? The Devil's Advocate, I think it's called, where the devil plays a lawyer. Yes, Christina, Devil's Advocate, that's the one. So anyways, there's clearly, yes, Al Pacino. There's clearly a Lilith figure in this, and she plays like a perfect, I think, representation of Lilith. You have Eve, right, who's Keanu Reeves, I can't even remember his name, Keanu Reeves' wife. And she's like the good, wholesome wife. She's trying to become a mother, but with this intervention of this other woman, she ends up having a miscarriage, right? And it's like really traumatic. The Lilith character is like attempting to seduce Keanu Reeves' character away from his wife. So the idea of like the killing of the children appears, the idea that Adam has these two wives appears. And so she's not obscure anymore. She's almost mainstream, you know. And I remember being in the Highlands of Scotland on a farm and like meeting somebody who worked on the farm who was named Lilith, like that was her given name. So, you know, these things aren't as obscure as they used to be. And, you know, certainly we mentioned Keats and the Romantics, they've had a huge influence on bringing her out. But generally when you see Lilith, she is oftentimes accompanied by like her opposite, right? So Eve or like some kind of virginal character, so that we can kind of, we can sort of bring up the kind of dichotomy of women's life. You know, you can either be the kind of virginal figure or you're like the whore, and there isn't really any space in between. And so Lilith can kind of come in to kind of represent that kind of dark aspect of the feminine, which is oftentimes juxtaposed with the more virginal and socially acceptable representation of the feminine. And there's always a danger, right? It's a danger to men, like it's a warning, I guess, to men to be careful against the seductress. It's also a warning to women that women need to be careful not to fall into these like non-approved forms of femininity, that we always have to make sure that our representations of our feminine sexuality are within like a certain set of parameters. So for like Eve, for instance, in the garden in Milton's Paradise Lost, she falls in love with the face of a woman that she sees in the lake, and she has to get pulled away by the angels and be told, right? No, you're only going to desire your husband. So she can't desire women. She also can't desire other men. There's also a little bit of an inkling of that with the snake, right? That they had a kind of sexual encounter. So it's always a kind of a corrective force. And I would say that this is true in ancient and early modern literature. It's also true in any kind of modern, and I haven't seen a lot, obviously, but in modern iterations of Lilith, it also feels very true that it's a kind of warning to both men and women there. Obviously, like later Immanuel Kant and his critique of pure reason is going to be like obsessed with this project, right? Like that we have to take things that seem different and kind of reduce them down to something that is understandable. And that I don't really like. I don't really like that attempt or that tendency to do it in that way. However, I think in Selden's work, I don't know, it feels like the first work of comparative mythology in a particular way, right? And obviously later on, James Fraser's work, The Golden Bough, would do something very similar, would take all of these sort of different iterations of these different spirits or gods and then kind of say that they come from a same or similar source. So why he's doing it, again, I'm not sure. I think that the effect that it has, though, is one which allows us to see Lilith more frequently than we might. So the effect is that, when I look at the moon, right, I can think of Lilith, even though like maybe traditionally we don't think of her as a moon spirit, right, or as a figure associated with the moon. Suddenly after the 17th century, she is. And not only is she, but we can't actually think of the good moon, right, the virginal moon, right, the Diana, the Artemis, without thinking of Lilith. And also with Venus, right, she's also associated with Venus. Why are we lumping together Lilith and Venus? Well, it's the dark side of love, right? It's the dark, chaotic, violent, emotional force of Eros. So it's not only this like nice, good virginal thing, but it's also violent and dark and scary. And so why he's doing it, I'm not sure, like what was the impetus behind it. But the effect is that it kind of forces us to widen what we can kind of imagine. So when we think we're actually thinking about something small and specific, we're not. That, we can say, oh, this is a shrine for Artemis, but it's not, right? It's a shrine for all of the things that are associated with Artemis, including the darkness. So it forces us to, I think, both be more open to dark and chaotic forces and to be more aware of them, but also to kind of recognize when they're there potentially, when on the surface it might seem like they're not there. So I would say that that's the effect of it. What was motivating him, I'm not sure, because I haven't seen another work before him that does this kind of like semiotic drift by like saying like, hey, this name and this name sound the same, therefore they're the same god. Or like when we think we're talking about Luna, we're actually talking about all these other things. His was the first work that does it to that extent. Before he wrote that in 1617, I haven't seen any other works that are doing that. If other people find them, like, let me know. I'm like dying to see that kind of stuff, because the effect of reading Selden on me was like very strong. Yeah, I think it was Sebastian Michaelis in 1613 who wrote that Lilith will either kill your baby or help your baby. And it depends on what mood she's in at the time. So like if you give her the right gifts and you like make the right sacrifices, that she'll help your baby. But like if she's in a bad mood, she's not going to help your baby at all. So I like that account because it gives Lilith like a personality and a kind of an agency, I think, that many of the other accounts that just see her as like mindless baby killer or like somehow obsessed with just enacting one sort of path, like now we see her as having the potential to do lots of different things. Also, this is happening at the same time that childbirth and midwifery is being sort of professionalized in the institution. And obviously there's been like so much already written about this. But one of the things that I find really interesting is that women's knowledge around kind of midwifery and childbirth was what we might call informal knowledge. It came from oral histories and oral traditions. It was often passed down generationally. And the institutional knowledge is very centralized, and it's oftentimes focused on book learning. So there was a kind of competition here between these two kinds of knowledges. And with the attempt to professionalize medicine, you need to have some kind of justification for it. And a lot of this was because midwives were oftentimes accused of being witches. And so, yeah, you could bring a midwife to come help your baby. And if she's in a good mood, she might, but she also might be a witch and she might kill your baby. So you're not really sure. So going with like the licensed male medical professional was seen to be the safer option. And, you know, it's been hundreds of years that this has really influenced the way that we think about childbirth and women's health. And just recently now, we're seeing a resurgence in interest in witchcraft. We're also seeing a resurgence in interest in midwives, and that they kind of work together in a very interesting way. Women can't do good magic, right? Anytime a woman does magic, according to early modern sort of written tradition, it's always going to be demonic magic. And, you know, James I in his Demonology, he outlines this very clearly, right? It's because women are weaker, right? We're weaker to sort of the influences of the demonic. And this is because of our bodies, right? I talk a lot about the body in the book and the woman's body and how the woman's body is perceived. So women's bodies are perceived to be more porous, right? To have more openings, and therefore perceived to be kind of more open to demonic influence, whereas the male body was thought to be like kind of solid and stable, much like the male mind. And so women couldn't really engage in good magic. Like anytime a woman did magic, it was always evil magic. And so when you had midwives, right, who are very often, they're supplementing kind of what we might call like hard medical practices, right, with what we might call magical practices, like amulets, prayers, certain kinds of rituals or small sacrifices. That is always going to be perceived as kind of evil magic. And a lot of this, like you said, has to do with what is written in books versus what is not written in books. And there's something that must feel so comforting about a book, right? That where all of its knowledge is contained, you can open it and you can look at it. And at one point, I remember the angels promised John Dee that they're going to give him such a book, right? The book of knowledge, the book of all of nature. And this must have been like so tantalizing for him to like want to get this book. So there's also a kind of tension, you know, obviously Elizabeth I was much more open to magical practice. She had John Dee as her court astrologer. Even then, though, there was a kind of discomfort where John Dee is constantly to others and to himself trying to placate them and say that this magic is good magic. John Dee is not a Satanist. He's not somebody who's interested in sort of cultivating dark magic for dark ends. He was a very pious Christian. He is somebody who sees himself as doing God's work. And if you couple that with some of the things that were sort of happening to him in these angelic experiences and experiments, you can see like it must have been really stressful for him. He's not really sure if Medimi, who's like showing him her genitals and like telling him to have sex with his friend's wife, is an angel or not. And yet he's so desperate for this kind of divine experience. And he's so desperate to be an instrument of God that he's willing to put aside any sort of reservations he might have and actually go through with it, right? So there's always a kind of tension between what is called natural magic and what is called spiritual magic. So natural magic is going to be things like, you know, looking at the spheres and the stars and sort of seeing how they influence the earth, or things like alchemy, thinking that certain stones are going to have certain kind of healing properties. Spiritual or demonic magic is calling on the forces of spirits or demons in order to do things for you. So even though I think that, you know, now we might look at them and see that there's actually quite a lot of philosophical similarity between these two things, there was a lot of attempt to kind of keep them separate at the time, so that like people who were engaged in magic would always be like, oh no, it's just natural magic. Like it's not spiritual magic. I'm not doing spiritual magic. And then people who were doing spiritual magic were treading on very thin ground because they had to constantly prove to themselves and others that the magic that they were doing was somehow acceptable, or acceptable in God's eyes, acceptable in the eyes of the church, or in the eyes of the university. A lot of people were working in universities at the time. So yeah, I think that there is a lot of overlap because witches don't use books. There are some rare exceptions to this, like I think Anne Bodenheim, who was arrested for witchcraft. She had grimoires in her house, and there are a few rare depictions of Circe, who's doing spells from a book. But in general, witches don't use books, and magicians do. So it's like the institutionalization of knowledge, the kind of book learnedness of knowledge, which gives it a kind of credence, and gives it a kind of pass in a way. Whereas if you're not doing that, then it's much harder to convince, somebody that what you're doing is somehow within the limitations of what a good Christian would do. This COMUS is like a masculine representation of Circe in a sense. So we're taking a kind of feminine deity or figure, and we're making them masculine. And so this obviously, and Milton in his own work says that the angels don't have a gender, right? So that they can take either sex. So there's a kind of a fluidity of what we might call quote unquote biological sex here in Milton's work, both in Comus and in his depictions of angels. So I think that there is definitely a lot of that. I am also really drawn, of course, to Dionysius. I think my favorite Greek tragedy is the Bacchae. I love when they burn Thebes to the ground. That I find is just like so moving and compelling. And one of the things is like, nobody knows if Dionysus is a man or a woman, and it's really stressing people out because we need to be able to put people into these categories. And if we can't, then they kind of are defying a certain kind of gendered control. Like, we don't know how to approach them. If somebody's gender is ambiguous, they're kind of free from certain kinds of constraints that exist with a certain binary gender. So there's a certain power in the kind of queerness of these figures. And in that queerness, I think there's a certain kind of dark power as well. Thank you so much for having me. This is my first book. This is my first book talk. So I'm really excited, and this was really great. So thank you. So if you're interested in the book, you can check it out, buy it through the bookstore. They have copies available. And if you're interested in talking about Lilith with me, just hit me up. I'd love to talk to you about it. I'm working on a book, which is, it's going to be very different from this one. So with this book, I was really constrained by sort of academic conventions. So there's only certain things that I can cite. There's only certain things that I can claim. There's only a certain kind of writing that I can engage in. And so for people who are looking for something that is maybe a little bit more resonant, if people find power in resonance rather than information, if you're looking for information on Lilith, man, this is your book for sure. But what I find powerful is sort of moving away from the conventions of like formal academic logic and trying to see, like I said, again, like what is in the kind of chaos of emotional space. So my book that I'm working on now is trying to kind of reconcile the duality of mind and body, or spirit and body, through eroticism. So my working title is Sex, Magic, and Mind-Body Dualism. So how can eros, or how can sexuality, or how can love help us to overcome this division between our body and our spirit? So that's what I'm working on now. And Atramentos is interested in it. So hopefully you will see that soon.